Mexican authorities are offering people participating in a migrant caravan towards the United States the possibility of legalizing their status in the country. G20 leaders back up Argentina's initiative to revise the International Monetary Fund's policy over surcharges, leaving the ground set for the creation of a new resilience subsidizer. The United Nations Climate Change Conference 2021 began in the Scottish city of Glasgow. From the headquarters of Telesur English in Havana, Cuba, this is From the South. I'm your anchor, Gladys Quesada, and we begin this news brief in Mexico, where authorities are offering people participating in a migrant caravan the possibility of legalizing their status in the country. The National Institute of Migration stated in a press release that members of the caravan had rejected the proposal made by the National Human Rights Commission to transfer them to federal capitals to process the migratory documents that will legalize their status and also their stay in the country. Meanwhile, the Mexican government denounced manipulation of the issue of migrant caravans in the media. Mexican authorities underlined that they are seeking to regularize the status of many of the members of the massive caravans that pass through its territory, and reiterated the intention to provide humanitarian assistance to pregnant women, children, and the disabled by issuing humanitarian visas. The Pro-Historical Memory Commission of El Salvador, formed by various organizations, reaffirmed its demands to the government for crimes against humanity committed during the armed conflict of 1980 to 1992. In the framework of the Day of the Death celebrations, the Commission demanded President Nayib Bukele to open the Army's archives to find the truth about what happened with our loved ones and accomplish accountability for those responsible for the atrocities. Human rights groups and survivors of the conflict also demanded the Legislative Assembly to approve a rightful and comprehensive system for truth, justice, reparation, and non-repetition, to provide legal and extrajudicial mechanisms from the integral satisfaction of the rights of the victims. And Honduras saw major mobilizations against its economic development and employment zones, which protesters stress amount to a flagrant violation of national sovereignty. Thousands of people took to the streets of Incholoma, northern Honduras, to protest against the so-called sovereign cities promoted by the government, which opponents note operate like states within the state. Campesino, indigenous, and Afro-descendant movements are communities where large-scale territorial concessions will result in mass displacement. And Bolivia is on a new path towards the lead in economic growth in Latin America, only after a year of President Luis Arce Catacora in office. The new policies adopted by the government to reanimate the country's production have paid off, as the Andean nation is on the path of leading the economic growth index in the region. All of this despite the negative impact in several key sectors due to the measures taken by the de facto government since November 2019, which took a toll on the most vulnerable population. Minister of Presidency Marianela Prada assured that what kept Bolivia in the regional lead of economic growth were the internal demand dynamics, public investments, income redistribution, and the social policies.
Compared to the second quarter of 2020, where we had a 12.9% drop, now our economy has recovered, and so by this second trimester, regarding the one of the previous year, the record is a 9.4% increase.
The presidents and ministers of Bolivia and Peru held the sixth binational meeting of the cabinets of both states in the city of La Paz on Saturday. As part of the meeting, they defined an agenda of over 100 points to work towards the development of their extensive shared border. Our correspondent, Freddy Morales, brings us the details.
This is the first official visit of the President of Peru, Pedro Castillo, to Bolivia. In La Paz, he fulfilled a protocol agenda together with his counterpart, Luis Arce. At the end of the official meetings, more than 100 topics and commitments were announced.
access to ports such as the Port of Ilo, environmental issues, labor issues, security issues, joint defense against crime, issues related to education and health within the framework of this pandemic that we have jointly addressed.
President Luis Arce highlighted the willingness to serve of the head of the Peruvian state, for which he granted him the highest state decoration of Bolivia, the Order of the Condor of the Andes in the highest degree of the Grand Collar. We have just successfully held the 6th binational cabinet, the result of which in the 4 work areas will allow us to continue advancing in the strengthening and deepening of our mutual agreements and our bilateral relations, with special emphasis on improving the living conditions of the peoples living on both sides of our borders. Of the 100 or so issues and commitments, one of the most important is the opening of the Peruvian port of Ilo as an alternative for Bolivian imports and exports overseas, and actions to combat the pollution of Titicaca, the world's highest navigable lake, shared by both states, whose situation affects over 3 million inhabitants on both sides of the border. To think of Peru is to connect ourselves to the Pacific Ocean. It is to project and expand our trade through the port of Ilo. It is to work together in 5th-generation communications. Brother Pedro, we are very hopeful and developing mechanisms to facilitate border transit and trade. We need to be innovative in binational infrastructure projects, cooperation in health matters, and generation of expanded economic spaces. Measures were confirmed to combat common border problems, such as drug trafficking, human smuggling, and trafficking of persons, vehicle theft, and illegal mining and lodging. Bolivia and Peru share a border stretching over 1,000 kilometers.
Freddy Morales, Telesur, Bolivia.
Thank you, Freddy, for this report, and we'll take a short break now. Join us again after this. Welcome back to From the South. G20 leaders backed up the decision to revise the International Monetary Fund's policy over surcharges. Now we go live to broadcast the COP26 climate change conference.
A climate crisis in the world which is affecting all human beings on Mother Earth. It's going to provoke the imminent collapse of humankind and of Mother Earth. Since 2010, Bolivia has proposed that the only solution to the climate crisis is through the fair and equal distribution of the atmospheric space and of these responsibilities, although different. As the UNFCCC establishes on climate change, as we have mentioned in the latest scientific reports and the reports from the Convention Secretariat, in order to mitigate the temperatures within the framework of the Paris Agreement, we need to reduce emissions significantly. It's the developed countries that have to take leadership to defend humankind and Mother Earth. It's a lie to say that the commitments for zero emissions before 2050 are a very ambitious target facing climate change, as what this means for developed countries is to avoid their historic responsibilities, dress up their inaction, their climate inaction, and continue to fill this atmospheric space for developing countries. In COP26, for this to be successful, it has to conclude with a decision that will lead to a path for the real and immediate reduction for developed countries with a maximum limit of 2030. In turn, the developing countries will have to gradually reduce our emissions based on the provisions from the developed countries, the provisions of financing, transfer of technology, and capacity building. Bolivia is contributing to the global climate solutions geared towards the horizon of buen vivir, living well in harmony with Mother Nature. We haven't stayed put with our arms crossed, and we are contributing with our national efforts, with actions to avoid the climate crisis. However, we're not going to be able to do this alone and with our own resources. And that's why we propose the need to implement immediately the framework of approaches not based on the markets, based in Article 6.8 of the Paris Agreement, to support with international cooperation and in a fair and equitable way the developing countries with their mitigation and adaptation processes to climate change. It's also important to make feasible the provision of financing for alternative methods of adaptation and mitigation for an integral approach and a sustainable one for the forests. Alternatives to payment for results, the agreement defined by Article 5 of the Paris Agreement. The Green Climate Fund should encompass the mandates of the COP and act urgently to offer financing for alternatives to REDD+. Bolivia has also proposed that the COP26 comprehensively consider all of the topics related to adaptation to offer coherence and coordination to the matters of adaptation and to align these to the definition of the global goals. This is essential to effectively support the adaptation in developing countries. Lastly, I would like to point out that COP26 in Glasgow is the time to stop hypocrisy with Mother Earth and to demonstrate clearly that we have a real will among the developing countries to impede its imminent collapse. Wherever this will already exists, and this will already exist among us, the developing countries. Thank you very much.
The President of Bolivia very much indeed for his contribution. Thank you, sir. And I'd now like to welcome the President of Palau. And Mr. President Serengil Wits, I know that you have travelled 5 days.
We will provide you with more details as the conference unfolds. Now we continue with this news brief. United Kingdom's Foreign Secretary Liz Truss said on Monday that France should back down within 48 hours from its reasonable threats of retaliation against her country over a post-Brexit fishing permit row. The statement came days after tensions between the two countries over permits for fishing boats, which has in France detained a British fishing vessel and threatened to block British boats from its ports, and tightened customs on lorries entering the country unless UK grants more licenses for small French vessels to fish in British waters. The dispute was triggered by the UK and Jersey government's decision to request European Union fishers to prove a track record of fishing in their waters as a prerequisite for receiving post-Brexit fishing permits. This meant many small French boats that enjoyed access to those waters before Brexit are now at risk of being banned from them. And South African vote in local elections set to challenge the ANC. This election will define the renewal of town hall members from municipalities of the 9 provinces in the country is administratively divided into. They will also serve to test the support the African National Congress has after the handling of the pandemic. The party governs South Africa from the 1994 elections, when the apartheid was put an end to and Nelson Mandela became president.
We know what the problems are. The problems are clear, and we have said that this time around we want to correct what has not been going well.
And we have more news coming up after a final short break, so stay with us. And now we go live back to Glasgow, UK, to broadcast the COP26 Summit Climate.
I, of course, follow with a lot of interest all the commitments about net zero in 2050 or 2060 or whatever. But the truth is, if the national determined contributions will not significantly improve in relation to emissions during this decade, we will not be able to reach 1.5 degrees. It will be irreversible to lose that possibility. But that creates a new kind of geography, because the geography in which all these things were thought was a geography in which there was developed countries that had essentially created the problem of climate change, and developing countries that were the victims of that, and then so there was a necessity of solidarity by developed countries providing developing countries with the resources necessaries to mitigation, but especially to adaptation, because they were already suffering the impacts of climate change. But now we have 3 groups of countries. We have developed countries, we have least developed countries, and developing countries of relatively small dimension, and we have middle-income countries that are emerging economies and that are relevant from the point of view of emissions. And so the question of solidarity now is more complex. So it has a dimension with the least developed countries and the majority of the developing countries that do not contribute much to climate change. And there is what it is essential, the 100 billion to materialize, and to materialize seriously. Let's be honest, the proposal that is on the table is not entirely responding to what is needed. I mean, it needs to be clear and guaranteed, and not a postponement that eventually, according to OECD, we will be able to. I mean, I understand the frustration of developing countries, so we need to do one step further, and we need to mobilize international financial institutions for adaptation and mitigation, and we need to have 50-50 for adaptation, and we need, I mean, this is to do what was supposed to be done based on the Paris Agreement seriously in terms of financial solidarity in all its aspects. But then we have the 3rd group of countries. And the problem is that this 3rd group of countries have natural determined contributions in which the volume of emissions will not decrease, sometimes will even increase during the next decade, but have real difficulties in relation to their productive sectors, and namely in relation to their energy sector, extremely dependent on coal. Which means that we need to find here, naturally asking them to make the maximum effort, we need to find here mechanisms of support for them to be able to accelerate the transition, which means, in my opinion, coalitions of developed countries that have the technology and the financial capacity to, on a case-by-case basis, see how we can have a plan in which each one of these big emerging economies is able to have a reduction of emissions in the next decade compatible to keeping the 1.5. Because if not, we will not get there. of course, this means speaking seriously with China, speaking seriously with India, speaking seriously with Indonesia, with Turkey, and etc. But we cannot put it on a simple base to say now you need to do also the same reduction that we are doing, because we have to recognize that their economies are more complicated to do so, and that so we need to find here a strong technological and financial coalition to be able to make them really reduce emissions in order to keep the 1.5, because without 1.5 there is no solidarity. The victims will be, we know. I mean, you look at SIDS in Caribbean and in the Pacific. Look at African countries with drought that is decimating entire regions. Look at the Corredor Seco in Latin America. I mean, it is clear that these two different fronts need to be addressed. The front of the financial support to developing countries and least developed and other developing countries that are not key emitters, which is essentially what we have been discussing, the 100 billion, adaptation, etc. And then a partnership that is needed with those developing middle-income emerging economies that are today an element without which it will be impossible to preserve 1.5.
Thank you. I totally agree with all that. Alok.
Thank you, Prime Minister. So I think over the past year I've had the privilege to visit many of the countries that are represented around this table, and actually to talk to communities on the front line of climate change who frankly weren't responsible for causing the...
And like this, we have come to the end of this news brief. But remember, you can find this and many other stories on our website at telesurenglish.net. And also, if you feel so inclined, please join us on social media. We are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Telegram. For Telesur English, I'm Gladys Quesada. Thank you for watching.